This is the Check It Out podcast from the Moraine Valley Library. I'm Troy Swanson.
I'm Joe Malarkey.
I'm Tish Hayes.
And we are joined today by faculty member from Communications and teaches literature, and also is the faculty coordinator for the Democracy Commitment, Tamara Coleman Hill. Tammy, thanks for joining us. This continues our podcast series about Giovanni's Room, our upcoming One Book, One College program. And we want to we're going to connect this with the Democracy Commitment today, but we wanted to start with a little discussion about James Baldwin.
Mm-hmm. So now you said you've read him through the years, and then you're reading, you just read the book, Giovanni's Room, the novel. And so how does that compare to like how you've known, say, Baldwin in the past?
Well,
as a reader.
I was actually introduced to Baldwin in a freshman composition class when I was at a community college. And before Baldwin, I never really thought of myself as a particularly political person. I never really identified with some of the political sort of identifiers that I identify with now. But that was huge for me to read people like Baldwin, Angela Davis, and other authors, Brent Staples, an African American.
Sure.
He actually was a journalist and became somewhat of a short story, essay, fiction author at that time. And for me, I was introduced to James Baldwin's essays, his what might be considered somewhat social commentary, his commentary on race, class, and in some ways gender, but more of a focus on race and class and race relations in America historically. I was also introduced to him through his longer text, a nonfiction text called Evidence of Things Not Seen.
Yes.
Where he writes about particular situations, and in particular, this piece was about murders that had happened in Atlanta, and how, in many ways, that particular community of African Americans were ignored, even in the obvious context of those murders that were happening at the time. So that text really dealt with race relations, very overtly race relations, and Baldwin's feelings about the continued racism in this country, even after the Civil Rights Movement. I believe that book was published in the 80s.
It was, because it was known at the time as the Atlanta Child Murders. A group of children, African American children, disappeared. And that was 1983. So his book is probably about 85. I would say, something like that. It's him and, now I'm forgetting her name, there's a fictionalized version called These Bones Are Not My Child. And that was sort of the other write-up on it. Because it really wasn't, it certainly was in the news, but it really wasn't.
It wasn't highlighted.
It was not highlighted.
Yeah.
So just for some of our listeners may not be familiar with Baldwin, the time span of his writings we're talking about 50s up through
the mid 40s to his death was 89. Okay, so it would be the late 80s.
Okay.
And the collected works of nonfiction is called The Price of the Ticket. And that's something that I read like about 25 years ago and just knocked me out.
Yeah, I think his nonfiction was what sort of brought me in, and then later as a English teacher, I used his fiction, his short piece, Sonny's Blues, in my classes in order to teach introduction to literature, introduction to fiction in that way. But for me, I've always seen him as an activist. More of an activist and less of a thinking of him as a fiction writer, although we know that he also produces really great fiction as well. So I sort of see him through that particular lens, which was really powerful for me as a freshman in a composition course, trying to figure out who I am in the world, and then looking at Baldwin, who's also exploring these race and identity issues.
So when you, from that perspective, when you pick up Giovanni's Room, how did Giovanni's Room read in the context?
One of the things I noted very quickly in the text was beyond the fictional story of the characters that he creates is the commentary, which is in many ways nonfiction. It's really about what's actually happening at the time, or him sort of overlaying social issues within that context that are really about a larger American context. And that's the way I sort of read Giovanni's Room. So he uses these fictional characters to explore problems that he's really having at home, and that home being across the shores. And I think that comes from me understanding him in that way, as opposed to understanding him as a person who writes fiction.
Right. I mean, I think I've read criticism, and Tish, you may have much to add on this, about Giovanni's Room, in that it's written by James Baldwin, but the characters he writes are purposefully white, and so he's playing with this, who belongs into what groups, and it speaks so much to some of his views on race and privilege. But he obviously purposely goes out of his way to not have characters that are African American, etc., but still offer this commentary.
I can comment on that. One of the things is that he said at the time he had published his first novel, which is Go Tell It on the Mountain, and it's somewhat based on his childhood, but it's certainly a work of fiction. It got great notices and sold modestly. Okay, and he realized, and you will see this if you really study the further life of, like, say, the Harlem Renaissance people, and I don't just mean the writers, I also mean the artists. There was a very small market for their work. And
which matters, because to make a living as an artist, you have to get money from somewhere.
Readership for this work, and he said at the time that he wanted to be known as a writer first and as a Negro writer second. And I think part of it was the realization that there is only so much of an audience for these stories. Now, then what's odd is then what he becomes famous for, really, is his essay work, his nonfiction work, which very much it's about many things. It certainly is about race conditions, but it's also about economics, class, all of these things. But he becomes a spokesperson, really for the civil rights movement. So be careful what you say you're never going to do. You know what I mean? Because it may turn back on you.
I think Baldwin is interesting in that the intentionality of creating characters that aren't black characters or Negro characters at the time. His choice in doing that is pretty wise, particularly understanding the black community and sort of the unwillingness, I would say, to talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, or also to ostracize those within the world of the Harlem Renaissance who were gay or lesbian. There are many figures who we have that were sort of shunned by the African American community at that time. So to create those characters is really interesting. And so he creates them in a way that kind of separates blackness from sexuality, and maybe makes it a little bit more palatable. But given that it wasn't really that successful within that community anyway, I mean, I think all these things are really interesting, and how they sort of play out.
I remember, I think it was an interview with him, and I can't remember which interview, but he talks about David, the protagonist of Giovanni's Room, as having, he can explore this sexuality, and he can also be terrified of what that might mean for him because he is white, because he is privileged, and that he lives in this world of privilege, that he would be losing something, to acknowledge his sexuality, and that fall from grace or whatever is what he was examining, and that for him as a black man, like that's such a different experience. Like him coming to terms with his sexuality is a different experience coming from, a place where he's not privileged in the same way as a white man is privileged. And I thought that was really interesting, just really putting it out there. Like, you can read this as this tragic love story, but there are so many other things that are happening, as you mentioned, that play with these ideas of privilege and power, and who's allowed to maintain that power. I mean, David gets to watch this man go to death and just feel really bad about it, which I think is...
Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! Watch it. And I think because I'm rereading it, from 25 years ago, and I think, like you, I'm seeing where his personal voice pops in to the text. And there's a moment, and I remember it from reading it 25 years ago, and it comes, and I was like, where is this? When is this going to happen? I know this happens. And it's late in the book. He has too long a sort of lingering look at a sailor walking down the street, and the sailor kind of gives him a withering, response. And the thing is that he reads the sailor's mind as saying, look, baby, I know you. And that is like so Baldwin. I was like, right there, and it's like these little moments where, like you become aware once again, who the, who the narrator is, who the storyteller is. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, I can see. So, with that setup, maybe we can shift and try to connect. I mean, I think some of these themes to some of your work with democracy commitment, and maybe real quick, what is the democracy commitment on our campus?
Yeah.
The Democracy Commitment is a national initiative which we've signed on to as a member institution that is trying to ensure that every community college student receives a civic education or an education in democratic practice. And that can come in a variety of different forms. But it is a national movement. Much of it is already a part of the work that many faculty members and others have been doing on campus already, but I think the commitment itself as an initiative is a way to document, encourage, support efforts that have already been done, and then create opportunities for faculty to do this even more, and for those who haven't, who feel like they haven't really been doing civic work in their classroom, have either the professional development opportunities or they have some things that they can tie their curriculum into.
Yeah, great. So talk about maybe how Giovanni's Room may connect to some, or themes may connect to some of your work.
One of the initiatives of the national democracy commitment is dealing with inequality. And inequality is broad. We sort of started talking about earlier this year inequality in terms of economic inequality in this country. But I also think there are ways that we can talk about inequality in terms of issues related to identity, or even on a more social and maybe less political, but then maybe not, thinking about our expectations. What are larger societal expectations in terms of who we are, or at least how people envision us to be, where we should be, and what we should be doing. And I think a lot of these issues are raised in Giovanni's Room. There's an interesting point in the text where he is having a conversation with I think it's a woman who is renting a room or apartment or whatever to him, and she says, you should be married. Just this long drawn out conversation about why he needs a wife, right?
And have babies.
Yeah, and have babies, of course, right? And she goes on and on about why, and she feels so bad for him, as if the poor thing can't take care of himself. And beyond just thinking about sexuality, I think that's a real issue for a lot of people, who I should be in the world, whether you're gay or straight, however you identify. The idea of the expectation of marriage is something that I think, one, we don't really talk about that much, and two, we end up falling into expectations that either our parents or community or family have for us in terms of those types of identity issues, which I think will connect broadly with our students in terms of identity. The other thing is that and as Tish, you were talking a little bit earlier, the one thing that I love about this text is the fact that these characters are white characters and not black characters, and there is a sort of privilege where a white male in particular can, even though there's problems and pushback, but can sort of explore issues of sexuality, where as a black male, I think there's still such a struggle with black men dealing with issues of sexuality and being not embraced or accepted by the black community, or having the experience of, well, this is not important, that let's deal with race issues, right? As if somehow we can pull those things apart and say, well, I don't want to deal with the sexuality thing in the same way that oftentimes black women deal with, well, I don't need to deal with the woman thing right now because I need to deal with this more important national agenda, which is the issue of race. And I think it would be an interesting issue for students, faculty, staff, for the community to think about how those things intersect, particularly for black males who are already expected to be overly masculine and these other sorts of problematic ways in which we think about black males.
And if I could throw in sort of, my thing, something that I think it's lost in the discussion of this book, because it starts to focus on David and David's thing, is Giovanni's an itinerant worker. Okay, it is the guy at the bar has gotten him a work permit. Okay, but he is really at the mercy of the economy as a foreigner.
Right.
And that has existed, through time. It still exists to this day.
Well, it's an interesting contrast between David and Giovanni, because it's set in Paris, but neither are French.
Paris.
Yeah, and so you have the rich American that's at a time of leisure on vacation, extended vacation in.
Good God, 2 years.
Yeah, 2-year vacation in Paris.
Torture.
In relationship with an immigrant struggling to make a living and to eat. They go through like, I haven't eaten in this many days.
Yes.
And then they fall into this realm of I'll take care of you if you do whatever for me.
Well, I was going to say that's the other thing that comes up. There is an element also of sexual exploitation as well on the part of the kind of benefactors that Giovanni has, right? He even says at one moment that he could probably get along for a few days without being harassed, right? And what does that harassment translate into? And I think that's also an issue of inequality that could be addressed, this issue of what do people do when they're in desperate situations? So when we think about other issues, these sort of slave labor or trafficking and those types of things, oftentimes people are caught up based on, well, I need this, and many times it's forced, but in other cases it's, well, I need a job or I need the money.
Right. Well, and so then Giovanni, commits murder, as the book tells, and then spoiler, I know, but we find out that from the beginning of the book that comes up. But part of the issue is there's a real issue left in the book is, does he really get treated fairly through the justice system? Does he really get to represent himself, and what is said about the parties involved? And I mean, that just a book that was written in the 50s that still is absolutely relevant today and still plays well today. Like it's right there. So.
And I think that's important too. That just shows Baldwin's, even within this fiction, his focus on these sort of real life conflicts or these real life systems that oppress or make it difficult for certain people, generally marginalized people, to sort of move through the world in a way that's much more free, right? Like your David character, right? There's a certain freedom that he has, but then a certain he's sort of constricted, I suppose, in some ways. That are different from these other figures around him.
Yeah.
So Tammy, thank you for sharing your insights with us, and
You're welcome.
we hope that this is the beginning of a conversation that we're going to spend, a couple of semesters working on. That please don't think that we have the final word, even though we really do trust our own opinions.
Right.
But so thank you so much from Troy.
Thank you.
Tish.
Thank you.
Tammy.
Thank you.
And Joe, thanks for listening.